Lisa Monroe lay quietly in her hospital bed, her body still weak from the effects of anesthesia. She had undergone a major surgery just hours earlier, and while the procedure was a success, her body was struggling to recover. Her mind was foggy, her limbs heavy, and her eyelids felt like weights, but she was slowly starting to regain her senses. The sterile scent of disinfectant filled the room, and the distant hum of hospital machines created a backdrop of white noise that should have been soothing but instead filled her with unease. Something about the atmosphere felt wrong off, even but Lisa couldn't put her finger on it. Across the hospital, her husband, Dr. James Monroe, was finishing a high-stakes surgery in the trauma unit. A renowned surgeon, James was well respected among his peers, known for his calm demeanor and his ability to handle even the most complex medical cases. He had insisted on being present during Lisa's procedure, but an emergency surgery had pulled him away at the last moment. James trusted his colleagues, but he couldn't help the gnawing worry at the back of his mind. He had spent countless hours saving others' lives now. His wife was the one in need of care. As soon as he finished his case, he planned to rush to her side. Lisa shifted slightly in bed, wincing at the dull ache in her abdomen. She reached for the call button to summon a nurse, hoping for some water to soothe her dry throat. The door to her room was slightly ajar, and through the sliver of space, she thought she noticed movement in the hallway. She dismissed it at first, assuming it was the usual hustle and bustle of hospital staff, but the shadow lingered longer than seemed normal. Her grogginess made it hard to focus, and she closed her eyes, deciding she was imagining things. Moments later, the door swung open with a startling force. 2 white police officers stepped inside, their boots thudding against the tile floor. Lisa blinked, trying to process what was happening. Both men wore grim expressions, their postures rigid and authoritative. One of them, the taller of the two, carried an air of impatience as he scanned the room. The other's hand hovered near his belt, where a pair of handcuffs dangled ominously. Lisa Monroe, the taller officer, barked, his voice cutting through the haze in her mind. Yes, Lisa replied weakly, her voice barely audible. She struggled to sit up, her muscles protesting the movement. What's going on? Why are you here? The officer ignored her question and took a step closer. We received a report about stolen medical equipment. You fit the description of a suspect. We need you to come with us. Lisa's heart raced, confusion and fear bubbling to the surface. What? That's impossible. I just had surgery. I'm a patient here. The second officer scoffed, crossing his arms. You can explain that downtown. We're not buying it. Lisa looked at them, incredulous. Check my chart. Talk to the doctors. I literally just got out of surgery. I don't understand what you're talking about. But the officers weren't listening. The taller one moved toward the bedside table, where a stack of papers and a leather folder sat. Inside the folder were detailed notes and diagrams for a groundbreaking medical device Lisa had been developing, a project she'd dedicated years of her life to as a bioengineer. The officer flipped through the papers, his brow furrowing as he examined the intricate sketches and calculations. What's this? He demanded, holding up the folder. Lisa's eyes widened. That's my work. It's part of a project I'm leading. Those are confidential documents. The officer's lips curled into a sneer. Confidential, huh? Looks more like stolen property to me. Lisa felt a surge of indignation, despite her physical weakness. That's not true. Those are my designs. You can contact my team or the hospital administration to verify it. But the officers had already made up their minds. The second one stepped forward, his tone turning more aggressive. We're not playing games here. Get out of the bed. Now. Lisa shook her head, her voice trembling but firm. I can't. I'm recovering from surgery. Please, this is a misunderstanding. The taller officer grabbed her wrist, his grip rough and unyielding. Lisa gasped in pain as he yanked her arm, pulling her halfway out of the bed. The IV line attached to her arm stretched taut before snapping loose, sending a spray of saline onto the floor. The heart monitor beside her bed began to beep erratically, the noise escalating with her rising heart rate. A nurse appeared in the doorway, alarmed by the commotion. "What's going on here?" she demanded, rushing to Lisa's side. "You need to stop. She's a patient." "Stay back," the second officer ordered, his hand moving to his holster. "This is official police business." The nurse hesitated, glancing between the officers and Lisa. "You're hurting her. She's not in any condition to move." "Let me get her doctor." "Enough," the taller officer snapped. He pulled Lisa fully out of the bed, causing her to cry out in pain. Her legs gave out beneath her, and she collapsed onto the cold tile floor. The nurse knelt beside her, trying to assess her condition, but the officers loomed over them, their presence oppressive. Lisa's vision blurred, and tears welled in her eyes, not from physical pain alone, but from the sheer humiliation and disbelief. How had things escalated so quickly? She tried to speak, to protest, but the words caught in her throat. In her mind, one thought repeated over and over: "Where is James?" As if in answer to her unspoken plea, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. Moments later, James appeared in the doorway, his surgical scrubs stained with blood from the emergency procedure he had just completed. His expression shifted from confusion to fury as he took in the scene before him: his wife on the floor, clutching her abdomen, the nurse frantically trying to help her, and two officers standing over them like vultures. "What the hell is going on here?" James demanded, his voice low and dangerous. The taller officer turned to him, unfazed. "This doesn't concern you. Step back." James clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he fought to control his anger. "That's my wife," he said, his tone icy. "And you're going to explain to me right now why you think it's acceptable to treat her like this?" "She's under investigation," the second officer said dismissively. "We have reason to believe." "You have no idea who you're dealing with," James interrupted, stepping closer. "Get your hands off her. Now." The officers hesitated, but their arrogance kept them from backing down. One of them muttered something under his breath about entitled doctors, but James ignored it. His attention was focused entirely on Lisa, who looked up at him with a mixture of relief and anguish. James knelt beside her, his voice softening. "I'm here, Lisa. I've got you." The nurse, emboldened by James's presence, finally stood and faced the officers. "You're putting her life at risk. If you don't leave this room immediately, I'm calling hospital security." The tension in the room was palpable, a standoff brewing as James rose to his full height, his piercing gaze locked onto the officers. For the first time, they seemed unsure, their confidence wavering in the face of his unyielding presence. But James wasn't done. In his mind, this was far from over. The heart monitor continued its sharp, relentless beeping as Lisa Monroe lay on the cold hospital floor, clutching her abdomen. The pain in her body was compounded by the sheer humiliation of being dragged from her bed like a criminal. The nurse, kneeling beside her, was doing her best to comfort her, whispering reassurances as she tried to calm Lisa's escalating panic. But the two officers looming over them showed no signs of backing down. Their presence was oppressive, their eyes cold and detached, as if Lisa were nothing more than a suspect, not a vulnerable patient. James Monroe stood in the doorway, his chest heaving as he fought to control the storm of emotions coursing through him. Anger, fear, and a deep sense of protectiveness for his wife all battled for dominance. He had just finished saving a life in the operating room. Yet here he was, watching his own wife being treated like a piece of evidence in some baseless investigation. His surgical scrubs were still smeared with blood, the adrenaline from his last procedure now fueling his resolve to put an end to this madness. "Step away from her," James commanded, his voice a low growl that echoed in the sterile hospital room. His tone was calm but carried an undeniable weight of authority that even the officers couldn't ignore. The taller officer, whose name tag read Reynolds, turned to face him with a smirk. "And who are you supposed to be?" "This doesn't concern you." "Back off, Doctor." James didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on Reynolds, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "It concerns me because that's my wife you've just assaulted. I want an explanation, and I want it now." Reynolds's smirk faded slightly, replaced with a flicker of irritation. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially by someone who wasn't wearing a badge. "We're conducting an investigation," he said sharply. "There's been a theft of high-value medical equipment from this hospital, and she fits the description of the suspect. Now, if you don't want to join her, I suggest you step back." James's jaw tightened as he forced himself to stay calm, though every fiber of his being screamed to lash out. "She's a patient. She just came out of surgery. Whatever description you have, it's wrong. If you'd done even the slightest bit of investigation, you'd know that." The second officer, a stockier man named Harris, chimed in, his voice dripping with condescension. "We don't need a lecture, Doc. We're doing our job. You should stick to doing yours." James took another step forward, standing between Lisa and the officers. His presence was commanding, his towering figure making even the confident officers hesitate. "Your job," he said slowly, enunciating each word, "does not include abusing patients. Your job is to protect and serve, not to drag a recovering woman out of her hospital bed based on nothing but baseless assumptions." Reynolds scoffed, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his expression now. "Look, we don't have time for this. She had materials on her bedside table that match what was reported stolen. That's probable cause. Those materials," James snapped, "are her research. She's a bioengineer working on life-saving medical devices. If you'd bothered to ask anyone in this hospital, they could have told you that." Lisa, still clutching her side, managed to speak, her voice weak but defiant. "Check my name on the patient list. Look at my medical records. I'm not a thief. This is my work. I was recovering from surgery, not running some criminal operation." Harris rolled his eyes. "Yeah, because every suspect claims they're innocent. We've heard it all before." James's patience finally snapped. "You're not hearing it this time. You're ignoring everything that contradicts the narrative you've decided to believe because it's easier for you to treat her like a suspect than to actually do your job. Well, not on my watch." The tension in the room was palpable. The nurse, still kneeling beside Lisa, glanced nervously between James and the officers. "Dr. Monroe," she whispered, "please be careful. They're not listening." But James wasn't backing down. He took another step forward, so close to Reynolds now that the officer had to tilt his head slightly to meet his gaze. "I'm not asking you," James said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm telling you. You will back away from my wife, or I will make sure you regret every single action you've taken here today." Reynolds's face reddened, his pride clearly stung. "Are you threatening me?" "It's not a threat," James replied evenly. "It's a promise. You've already violated her rights. You've put her health at risk. And now you're standing here, doubling down on your mistakes instead of admitting you're wrong. That's not just negligence, it's malpractice." Harris shifted uncomfortably, his bravado faltering under James's relentless glare. "Let's just calm down," he muttered, glancing at Reynolds. Maybe we should check her records just to be sure. Reynolds shot him a withering look. We're not backing down now. That would make us look weak. Looking weak, James cut in, is better than being wrong. And you are wrong. The nurse seized the opportunity to speak up, her voice trembling but resolute. I can pull up her records right now. It'll only take a moment. Please, let me prove that she's a patient here. Reynolds hesitated, clearly torn between his ego and the growing realization that he might be in over his head. Harris, sensing the shift in the room, nodded reluctantly. Fine, let her check. The nurse quickly stood and moved to the computer terminal near the bed, her fingers flying across the keyboard. The tension in the room was suffocating as everyone watched her work. The only sounds were the rapid clicking of the keys and the faint beeping of the heart monitor, which was finally beginning to stabilize. After what felt like an eternity, the nurse turned the screen toward the officers. Here, she said firmly. Lisa Monroe. Admitted for surgery this morning. Procedure completed at 10:47 a.m. She's been in this room ever since. James folded his arms across his chest, his expression triumphant but still seething with anger. Satisfied. Reynolds stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. He didn't respond, his pride clearly preventing him from admitting he was wrong. Harris, however, looked visibly uncomfortable. If the records check out, maybe we should. No, Reynolds snapped, cutting him off. This doesn't prove anything. Those documents on her table still need to be verified. For all we know, she's using this hospital as a cover. James's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. Do you even hear yourself? You're so desperate to justify your actions that you're willing to invent conspiracy theories to cover up your incompetence. You're done here. Both of you. Reynolds took a step back, his face a mask of barely concealed rage. We're not done until we say we're done. Then let's escalate this, James replied coldly. I'll call the hospital administration, the chief of police, whoever I need to make sure you're held accountable. Before Reynolds could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed down the hallway. A group of security guards appeared in the doorway, their expressions grim. The lead guard, a burly man with a no-nonsense demeanor, surveyed the scene and immediately turned to the officers. What's going on here? He demanded. Reynolds opened his mouth to speak, but James cut him off. These officers assaulted my wife, a recovering surgical patient, and threatened hospital staff. I want them removed immediately. The guard's eyes widened as he took in Lisa's disheveled state on the floor and the shattered IV line. He turned back to the officers, his voice cold. You two need to leave. Now. Reynolds looked ready to argue, but Harris grabbed his arm. Let's go, he muttered, his voice low. We've done enough. Reluctantly, Reynolds followed Harris out of the room, but not before throwing a final glare at James. This isn't over, he hissed. James ignored him, immediately kneeling beside Lisa. His voice softened as he spoke to her, his hand gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. It's over for now, he murmured. I'm here. I've got you. Lisa managed a faint smile, her eyes brimming with tears. Despite the chaos, she knew she was safe, for now. James Monroe knelt beside his wife, his hands trembling as he gently supported her weakened frame. Lisa's face was pale, her breathing shallow, and her body radiated a fragility that James had never seen before. Despite her strength and resilience, the ordeal was taking a visible toll on her, both physically and emotionally. He could feel her body tense with pain as he adjusted her position on the cold tile floor. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, meeting his, filled with exhaustion and anguish, and it broke his heart. Yet, he couldn't let his emotions overwhelm him. Not now. There was still too much at stake. The nurse, who had been doing her best to assist Lisa amid the chaos, turned toward James. Her voice was soft but laced with urgency. "Dr. Monroe, we need to get her back into bed and stabilize her vitals. She's not in any condition to be moved around like this." James nodded, his mind racing. He glanced over his shoulder at the group of hospital security guards who now stood clustered in the doorway. Though they had successfully forced the officers out of the room, the lingering tension was palpable. It was clear that the situation was far from resolved. The taller officer, Reynolds, had left reluctantly, his angry glare and final muttered threat hanging in the air like a storm cloud. His partner, Harris, had been quieter, his discomfort evident, but James could sense that neither man would back down without further resistance. "Help me lift her," James said to the nurse, his voice calm but firm. Together, they carefully eased Lisa off the floor and onto the bed, taking care to reconnect the IV line and monitor her vital signs. James's years of experience in high-pressure situations allowed him to compartmentalize his anger, focusing instead on ensuring Lisa's immediate safety. The nurse adjusted the monitor, and the rhythmic beeping of Lisa's heart rate filled the room once again. Her vitals were stabilizing, but James knew she needed rest, not another confrontation. As he straightened up, his mind shifted to the next step. This wasn't just about what had happened to Lisa, this was about ensuring it didn't escalate further. He turned toward the lead security guard, a broad-shouldered man with a no-nonsense demeanor named Delgado. "Thank you for stepping in," James said, his voice low but filled with authority. "But this isn't over. Those officers are going to come back unless we act now." Delgado nodded grimly. "I figured as much. They seemed determined to push this, even after we made it clear they were out of line." "They're not just out of line," James said, his anger bubbling beneath the surface. "They violated her rights, assaulted her while she was vulnerable, and ignored every piece of evidence that could have proven their accusations wrong. This wasn't an investigation, it was a display of power, and I won't let them get away with it." Delgado's expression hardened. "What do you need from us?" "Lock down this floor," James replied without hesitation. "No unauthorized personnel come in or out. Contact hospital administration and inform them of what happened. I'll deal with the police." The guards exchanged uneasy glances, but Delgado didn't hesitate. He pulled out his radio and began issuing orders to his team. "Attention all units, we've got a code white on the surgical floor. Full lockdown protocol. No one enters without clearance." James turned his attention back to Lisa, his hand gently brushing her hair away from her face. "I'm here, Lisa," he whispered. "I won't let anything else happen to you." Her lips parted, and she managed to whisper, "Be careful, James." His jaw tightened as he leaned closer, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. "Always." The sound of voices in the hallway broke the fragile calm. James looked up sharply as the unmistakable tone of Officer Reynolds echoed down the corridor. He was back, his voice raised in anger, arguing with Delgado and the other guards. "You can't lock us out," Reynolds was shouting. "This is an active investigation, and you're obstructing justice. Let us through." Delgado's voice remained steady but firm. "You're not authorized to be on this floor, officer. You've already caused enough harm. Leave, or we'll escalate this to your superiors." "Go ahead and escalate it," Reynolds shot back. "I'm not leaving until we finish what we started." James felt his blood boil as he listened to the exchange. He turned to the nurse. "Stay with Lisa. Don't let anyone near her." The nurse nodded, her face pale but determined. James straightened his back, adjusted his scrubs, and strode toward the door. He could feel the tension in his shoulders, the controlled anger simmering just beneath the surface. When he stepped into the hallway, his presence immediately commanded attention. The guards stepped aside, and Reynolds turned to face him, his expression darkening. "Back off," Dr. Reynolds sneered. "You're not in charge here." "On the contrary," James replied coldly. "This is my hospital, and you're trespassing." Reynolds's smirk faltered for a brief moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "We're here on official police business. You can't stop us." James took a step closer, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "You're not conducting an investigation. You're harassing a patient who has done nothing wrong. You assaulted my wife, put her health at risk, and now you're trying to justify it with baseless accusations. This ends now." Reynolds's hand moved to his belt, hovering near his holstered weapon. "Are you threatening me, Doctor?" James didn't flinch. "I don't need to threaten you. I have every piece of evidence I need to hold you accountable for what you've done. And believe me, I will." Harris, who had been standing silently behind Reynolds, stepped forward hesitantly. "Maybe we should take a step back," he said quietly. "This is getting out of hand." Reynolds turned on him angrily. "Don't start with that, Harris. We're not backing down." James seized the moment, his voice sharp and commanding. "Harris, listen to me. You know this isn't right. You're putting your career on the line by following his lead. Walk away now, and I'll make sure you're not dragged down with him." Harris hesitated, his eyes darting between James and Reynolds. It was clear he was torn, but Reynolds's presence loomed over him like a shadow. "I can't just." "You can," James interrupted. "This is your chance to do the right thing. Don't let pride or loyalty to the wrong person ruin your life." Before Harris could respond, Reynolds took a step forward, his posture aggressive. "Enough of this. We're taking her in, one way or another." James's patience finally snapped. He stepped directly into Reynolds's path, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You're not laying another finger on her." Reynolds glared at him, his hand tightening on his belt. For a moment it seemed like the situation would erupt into violence, but Delgado and the other guards closed ranks around James, forming a wall between him and the officers. "This is over," Delgado said firmly. "Leave now, or you'll be escorted out by force." Reynolds's face flushed with rage, but he knew he was outnumbered. He muttered something under his breath, then turned sharply on his heel and stalked down the hallway. Harris followed reluctantly, casting one last glance at James before disappearing around the corner. James exhaled slowly, the tension in his body beginning to release. But he knew this wasn't the end. Reynolds wouldn't let this go, and James needed to be prepared for whatever came next. For now, though, he returned to Lisa's side, determined to protect her at all costs. James Monroe stood by Lisa's hospital bed, his jaw clenched as he processed the events that had unfolded. The room was quieter now, but the tension lingered in the air like an unwelcome guest. Lisa lay motionless, her eyes closed, her chest rising and falling in shallow, rhythmic breaths. The nurse had assured James that her vitals were stable, but the trauma she had endured wasn't something that could be measured by machines. James reached out, brushing his hand gently across her forehead, as if the simple touch could shield her from the chaos still swirling outside the room. The hospital floor was on lockdown, but James knew that wouldn't hold the police at bay for long. Officer Reynolds was not the type to walk away quietly, and James had seen the seething anger in the man's eyes before he left. Reynolds's bruised ego was dangerous, a combustible element that could ignite at any moment. James could almost feel the storm brewing in the distance, and he wasn't about to wait idly for it to reach them. He had spent his life solving high-stakes problems in the operating room now. He would use every ounce of that same precision and focus to protect Lisa. Delgado, the head of hospital security, stepped into the room, his presence a mix of authority and unease. "Dr. Monroe," he began, his voice low, "we've done what we can to secure the floor. No one gets in without my team's approval." James nodded, but didn't take his eyes off Lisa. "That won't stop them. Reynolds isn't going to let this go. He's already made it clear that he's willing to break every rule to get what he wants." Delgado sighed heavily. "I've dealt with cops like him before. They think the badge gives them the right to do whatever they want. But you're right, he's not done. I've already notified hospital administration, but this might escalate before they can intervene." James finally looked up, his eyes sharp and unyielding. "Then we escalate first. I need you to pull the security footage from this floor. I want everything the officers entering Lisa's room, the way they handled her, the moment they disconnected her IV, every second of it." Delgado hesitated. "We'll need authorization for that, and it might take some time." "We don't have time," James interrupted, his tone firm but controlled. "You've seen what they've done. If we don't act now, they'll twist this to fit their narrative. I need proof to hold them accountable." Delgado nodded reluctantly. "I'll see what I can do." As Delgado left the room, James took a deep breath and leaned against the edge of Lisa's bed. He hated feeling powerless, and the image of Lisa crumpled on the floor, vulnerable and in pain, replayed in his mind like a haunting refrain. He wasn't going to let that image define this day. He wasn't going to let Reynolds win. The sound of a phone vibrating broke his thoughts. James reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, the screen lighting up with an incoming call. It was from Dr. Patel, the hospital's chief administrator. James answered quickly, his voice sharp with urgency. "Patel, tell me you've been briefed." "I have," Patel said, his tone grave. "Security just informed me about what happened. I'm on my way to the floor now, but James, this is already spiraling. We've had calls from the precinct, and they're threatening to escalate this to higher authorities if we don't cooperate." "Cooperate?" James's voice rose, his frustration boiling over. "They assaulted my wife, Patel. She's a patient, recovering from surgery, and they treated her like a criminal. And now they're doubling down on their lies." "I understand your anger," Patel said carefully. "But we need to handle this delicately. The last thing the hospital needs is a public scandal." James's grip tightened on the phone. "This isn't about the hospital's reputation. It's about Lisa. She's the victim here, and I won't let her be silenced because you're worried about bad press." Patel sighed. "Just hold tight until I get there. We'll figure this out." James ended the call without replying, his frustration mounting. He looked back at Lisa, her face peaceful despite everything, and it only fueled his determination. He couldn't rely on bureaucracy to save her. He needed to take matters into his own hands. As a sudden commotion in the hallway drew his attention. James stepped out of the room to see Delgado returning, flanked by 2 more security guards. Behind them was Reynolds, his face red with fury, and Harris, who looked increasingly uncomfortable. Reynolds was arguing loudly, his voice echoing down the corridor. "You can't keep me out," Reynolds barked, pointing an accusatory finger at Delgado. "This is obstruction of justice. You're harboring a suspect, and I'm not leaving until she's in custody." Delgado stood his ground, his arms crossed over his chest. "I told you before, officer. This floor is on lockdown, and you have no authority here. If you don't leave willingly, I'll have you escorted out." Reynolds sneered. "I'd like to see you try." James stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate attention. "You're still here," he said coldly. "I thought I made it clear that you weren't welcome." Reynolds turned to face him, his expression darkening further. "Dr. Monroe," he said mockingly, You seem to think you're in charge here. Let me remind you I'm the law. James didn't flinch. You're not the law. You're a bully with a badge, and you're about to learn the hard way that you're not above accountability. Harris shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Reynolds and James. Maybe we should. Shut up, Harris Reynolds snapped. You're either with me or against me. James took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. You're not taking another step toward my wife. You've already done enough damage. Reynolds smirked, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. And what are you going to do? Stop me yourself. James's reply was measured, almost surgical in its precision. If I have to. The tension in the hallway was palpable, the air thick with the promise of confrontation. Delgado and his guards stood ready, their stances firm, while Reynolds and Harris teetered on the edge of action. For a moment, it felt like the entire hospital had paused, holding its breath. Then, a voice cut through the tension. What the hell is going on here? Everyone turned to see Dr. Patel approaching, his expression a mix of anger and authority. He strode forward, his presence adding another layer of gravity to the situation. Reynolds Patel said sharply, "You've overstepped your bounds. This is a hospital, not your personal playground. I suggest you leave before you make this situation worse." Reynolds bristled, his pride refusing to let him back down. "I'm conducting an investigation." "Your investigation ends here," Patel interrupted. "I've reviewed the security footage, and it's clear you've acted recklessly and without cause. If you don't leave immediately, I will escalate this to the chief of police myself." Reynolds's face turned crimson, but he didn't argue. He turned on his heel and stormed off, muttering under his breath. Harris hesitated for a moment before following, casting a final glance at James. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, regret, perhaps, but he said nothing. As the officers disappeared down the hallway, Patel turned to James. "We'll file a formal complaint," he said. "This isn't over, but for now Lisa is safe." James nodded, but his expression remained tense. He knew Patel's words were meant to reassure him, but they felt hollow. Lisa had been violated, her dignity stripped away, and no bureaucratic process would erase that pain. He returned to Lisa's room, his resolve stronger than ever. This wasn't just about justice for Lisa. It was about exposing a system that allowed people like Reynolds to wield their power unchecked. And James wouldn't stop until that system was held accountable. James Monroe sat at his wife's bedside, his hand gently holding Lisa's, his mind racing despite the relative calm in the room. The chaos outside, the shouting, the threats, the tension had subsided for the moment, but James knew it was temporary. Reynolds was gone, but he wouldn't stay gone for long. The man's bruised ego and stubborn arrogance would ensure he came back, likely with reinforcements. Lisa's breathing was shallow, her face pale, and James could tell that the stress and physical strain were taking a toll on her body. Every second felt like borrowed time, a brief respite before the inevitable next storm. The heart monitor beside the bed beeped steadily, a reminder of the fragility of the moment. James couldn't let his guard down. Not yet. Lisa needed him now more than ever, and he couldn't afford to make a mistake. His medical instincts kicked in, analyzing her vitals, her breathing pattern, the slight tremor in her fingers. But this wasn't a purely medical situation. This was something far more dangerous, and James knew it required more than the skills he used in the operating room. This was about strategy, about staying one step ahead of people who had already proven they were willing to cross every line. The door to the room creaked open slightly, and Delgado stepped inside. His face was grim, his body tense, and James immediately knew he wasn't bringing good news. Dr. Monroe Delgado said quietly, closing the door behind him. "We've got a problem." James straightened, his jaw tightening. "What now?" "They're back," Delgado said, his voice low but firm. "Reynolds, Harris, and 2 more officers. They're insisting on speaking to you and hospital administration. They're saying they have a warrant." James's eyes narrowed. A warrant? For what? What possible justification could they have after everything they've done? Delgado shook his head. "They're claiming it's related to the theft investigation. I don't know the specifics, but they're determined to push their way back onto the floor. I've got my team holding them off for now, but it's only a matter of time before they escalate." James exhaled sharply, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. He turned to look at Lisa, her face peaceful despite the turmoil surrounding her. "I need to protect her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever it takes, I need to keep them away from her." Delgado hesitated, then nodded. "We'll do everything we can on our end, but you should be prepared. If they're bluffing about the warrant, we can hold them off. But if it's real..." James didn't let him finish. "I'll handle it." Delgado frowned. "How?" James's expression hardened. "Leave that to me. Just make sure your team buys me enough time." Delgado nodded reluctantly and left the room, leaving James alone with Lisa once more. He leaned down, his lips brushing her forehead. "I'll be right back," he murmured. "Stay strong for me." He straightened and strode to the door, his movements purposeful. His mind was already formulating a plan, each step calculated and deliberate. He didn't just need to stop Reynolds, he needed to dismantle the entire narrative the officer was building. And he had an idea how to do it. James made his way to the nurses' station, where a group of staff members stood huddled, their faces etched with worry. The tension in the air was palpable, and James knew that everyone on the floor was aware of what was happening. The hospital was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place of healing and safety, but today it had become a battlefield. "Nurse Daniels," James said, addressing the woman who had been by Lisa's side earlier, "I need access to the hospital's internal systems. Specifically, I need the records of the stolen equipment Reynolds keeps mentioning. I need to see if there's any merit to his claims." Daniels hesitated, glancing at the other nurses. "Dr. Monroe, I'm not sure if we're authorized to." "I'm not asking for permission," James interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "If there's any chance I can stop this, I need information. The police are exploiting a lack of clarity to justify their actions, and we can't let them keep doing it." Daniels bit her lip, then nodded. "Follow me." She led him to a computer terminal, typing in her credentials to access the hospital's database. "What exactly are we looking for?" she asked. "Any reports of missing equipment," James said. "Inventory logs, incident reports, anything that could give us a clear picture." Daniels nodded and began searching. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. James tapped his fingers against the desk, his impatience growing with every second. Finally, Daniels stopped typing, her eyes scanning the screen. "There's a report here," she said slowly. "Filed 3 days ago. A piece of experimental monitoring equipment went missing from one of the research labs." James frowned. "Which lab?" Daniels clicked on the report, pulling up the details. "Lab C12. It's part of the facility where your wife's team conducts their work." James's stomach sank. He knew Lab C12 well. It was where Lisa spent countless hours developing her prototypes. If the stolen equipment was connected to her work, it would explain why Reynolds had targeted her. But it didn't make the accusations any less baseless. "Is there any indication that Lisa was involved?" James asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil churning inside him. Daniels shook her head. "No, The report doesn't name anyone specifically. It just states that the equipment was last accounted for during a routine check and was discovered missing the next day. James leaned back, his mind racing. Reynolds must have latched onto the report and used it as an excuse to harass Lisa. But the lack of concrete evidence meant the officer was operating on pure speculation or worse, prejudice. James needed more. "Can you pull up security footage from the lab?" he asked. Daniels hesitated. "I'll need approval for that." "Get it," James said firmly. "I'll deal with anyone who tries to push back." Daniels nodded and picked up the phone, speaking quickly to someone on the other end. Meanwhile, James turned his attention to the corridor outside the nurse's station. He could see Reynolds and the other officers standing at the far end, their postures tense and their expressions hard. Delgado and his security team stood between them and the rest of the floor, creating a physical barrier that Reynolds clearly found infuriating. James's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling his attention away. He glanced at the screen. It was Dr. Patel again. James answered, his voice clipped. "What is it?" James Patel began, his tone cautious. "I've been speaking with the police chief. He's willing to intervene, but he needs something concrete to justify pulling his officers off the case." "I'm working on it," James replied. "Give me a little more time." "Hurry," Patel said. "Reynolds is pressing hard, and the chief won't be able to hold him back indefinitely." James ended the call and turned back to Daniels. "Do we have the footage?" Daniels nodded, gesturing to the screen. "It's pulling up now." James leaned over her shoulder, watching as the footage loaded. The grainy video showed Lab C12 at various points over the past week. He scanned the images carefully, his eyes darting back and forth as he searched for anything out of place. "There," Daniels said, pointing to the screen. "That's the day the equipment was reported missing." The footage showed a figure entering the lab, their movements deliberate but not overtly suspicious. James squinted, trying to make out the details, but the angle made it difficult to identify the person. "Can you enhance this?" he asked. Daniels shook her head. "This is the highest resolution we have." James cursed under his breath. The footage was inconclusive, but it was clear that whoever had taken the equipment wasn't Lisa. The figure was taller, bulkier, and moved with a confidence that suggested they knew the layout of the lab well. "This proves she had nothing to do with it," James said. "We need to get this to Delgado and Patel." Daniels nodded and began transferring the footage. James turned his attention back to the hallway. Reynolds was still there, his frustration evident as he argued with Delgado. James's fists clenched at his sides. This wasn't just about protecting Lisa anymore. It was about exposing Reynolds for the reckless, power-hungry bully he was. As the footage finished transferring, James felt a renewed sense of determination. He wasn't just fighting for Lisa, he was fighting for justice, for accountability, and for the truth. And he wasn't going to stop until he won. James Monroe's pulse quickened as he strode down the hallway toward the group of officers and security guards locked in a tense standoff. His mind was racing, the freshly obtained evidence from the lab footage burning a hole in his thoughts. This was the breakthrough he needed, the proof that Lisa had nothing to do with the missing equipment. But this wasn't just about exonerating his wife, it was about stopping Reynolds and exposing his reckless abuse of power before someone else suffered. Reynolds stood at the center of the confrontation, his face flushed with anger and his posture rigid with frustration. His two backup officers flanked him, their hands resting near their belts, as if ready to escalate at the slightest provocation. Delgado and his security team held firm, creating a human wall between the officers and the locked-down hospital floor. The tension in the air was suffocating, a powder keg ready to ignite. Dr. Monroe, Delgado said as James approached, his voice loud enough to cut through the chaos. "We're holding them here, but they're demanding access. They claim they have a warrant." James's eyes flicked to Reynolds, whose smug expression only stoked the fire of his anger. "Let me handle this," James said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. He stepped forward, squaring his shoulders as he faced Reynolds. "You're back," James said coldly, locking eyes with the officer. "I assume this means you didn't learn your lesson the first time." Reynolds smirked, his confidence unwavering. "I've got the law on my side, Doctor, and this time there's nothing you or your hospital security can do to stop me." "Let me see the warrant," James demanded, extending his hand. Reynolds's smirk faltered slightly, but he pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it over. James unfolded it, scanning the document carefully. The language was vague, the justification weak, and it was clear the warrant had been rushed through without proper review. Still, it was enough to give Reynolds the excuse he needed to push his way back into the hospital. "This is flimsy at best," James said, handing the paper back. "It's based on conjecture, not evidence. But fortunately for you, I have what you're looking for." Reynolds raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued despite himself. "Oh, and what would that be?" James gestured toward the nurse's station, where Nurse Daniels stood with a USB drive containing the lab footage. "We pulled the security footage from the lab where the equipment went missing. It clearly shows someone else taking the device, someone who doesn't remotely resemble my wife." Reynolds hesitated, his bravado wavering as James's words sank in. "Let me see it," he demanded, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice now. James held up a hand. "Not so fast. Before I show you anything, I want your word that you'll back off once you see the truth. No more harassment, no more baseless accusations. You walk away, and you don't come near my wife again." Reynolds' eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. "You don't make the rules here, Doctor." "No," James shot back, his voice rising. "But I'm the only one standing between you and a lawsuit that will end your career. So, what's it going to be?" The hallway fell silent, all eyes on Reynolds as he weighed his options. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Fine. Show me the footage." James motioned for Nurse Daniels, who stepped forward and handed the USB drive to Delgado. The head of security plugged it into a nearby laptop, the screen flickering to life as the footage began to play. Everyone crowded around, their gazes fixed on the grainy video. The timestamp on the footage showed the lab at night, the room dimly lit by the glow of computer monitors. A figure entered the frame, moving with purpose. They were taller than Lisa, broader in the shoulders, and wore a hooded jacket that obscured their face. The figure approached the equipment, checked their surroundings, and then swiftly removed the device, tucking it under their arm before slipping out of view. James crossed his arms, his voice cutting through the silence. "That's your suspect, not Lisa. Not my wife. Someone else entirely." Reynolds stared at the screen, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles in his neck stood out. Harris, standing just behind him, leaned forward, his expression shifting from skepticism to realization. "He's right," Harris muttered, almost to himself. "That's not her." Reynolds turned sharply, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. "This doesn't prove anything. For all we know, she could have been working with that person." James took a step closer, his voice cold and unrelenting. "You're grasping at straws, Reynolds. Admit it, you targeted Lisa because it was easy, because she fit some profile in your head. You didn't have evidence, you didn't have cause, and now you don't have a case." Reynolds opened his mouth to argue, but James cut him off, his voice rising with righteous fury. "You assaulted her. You dragged her out of her bed, disconnected her IV, and put her life at risk, all because you refused to admit you might be wrong. Well, now the truth is staring you in the face, and you still can't let it go." The other officers shifted uncomfortably, their confidence clearly shaken. Harris took a step back, his gaze dropping to the floor. Delgado and his security team stood firm, their expressions hard as they waited to see how Reynolds would respond. Finally, Reynolds turned to Delgado, his voice dripping with venom. "This isn't over. You think one piece of footage is going to clear her? We'll see about that." Delgado stepped forward, his tone calm but authoritative. "No, Officer Reynolds. It is over. You've overstepped your bounds, and if you try to push this any further, I'll personally see to it that your department faces the consequences." Reynolds glared at him but said nothing. Instead, he turned on his heel and stormed down the hallway, his backup officers trailing after him. Harris hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking to James. "For what it's worth," Harris said quietly, "I think you're right. About all of it." James didn't respond, his focus already shifting back to Lisa. As the officers disappeared around the corner, Delgado placed a hand on James's shoulder. "You did good, Doctor. You protected her." James nodded, but the tension in his chest didn't ease. "It's not enough," he said. "They'll keep coming back unless we make it impossible for them to touch her or anyone else ever again." Delgado nodded. "We'll do everything we can on our end, but you should focus on her now. She needs you." James turned back to Lisa's room, his heart heavy despite the small victory. He knew Delgado was right. Lisa was safe for now, but the battle wasn't over. He would have to fight harder, smarter, to ensure she could recover in peace, and that Reynolds' actions wouldn't go unpunished. When he entered the room, Lisa's eyes fluttered open, and she managed a faint smile. "Did you handle it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "For now," James replied, sitting beside her and taking her hand in his. "But I'm not stopping until it's finished." Lisa squeezed his hand weakly, her eyes filled with gratitude and exhaustion. "You always do what's right." James leaned down, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Always. And I'm not letting them win, Lisa. Not ever." For the first time that day, he allowed himself a moment of stillness, sitting by Lisa's side as the beeping of the heart monitor filled the room. He knew the fight wasn't over, but for now, she was safe, and that was all that mattered. James Monroe sat quietly by Lisa's bedside, the storm of emotions inside him finally giving way to a tentative sense of relief. Lisa was stable now, her vitals consistent, and her breathing even. The ordeal of the day had left her exhausted, but she was safe. For now. James gently held her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles as he replayed the events in his mind. The chaos, the confrontation, and the way Officer Reynolds had clung to his baseless accusations, all of it had drained him. But it had also steeled his resolve. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. A soft knock on the door drew James's attention. Dr. Patel entered, his expression somber but resolute. He gestured for James to join him in the hallway. James glanced back at Lisa, then rose from his chair, careful not to disturb her. Outside, Patel leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. "We've managed to send the footage and a formal report to the police chief," Patel said, his voice low. "Delgado did an excellent job documenting everything. Reynolds has been pulled from active duty pending an investigation." James's jaw tightened. That's a start. But it's not enough. Patel nodded, understanding the fire behind James's words. "It's never enough, is it? This kind of behavior doesn't just disappear because one officer is suspended. It's systemic. You and I both know that." James exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "What about Lisa? What guarantee do I have that they won't come after her again? That they won't try to twist this into something it's not? Delgado's team has already bolstered security on this floor, Patel assured him. And I've reached out to a legal team. They're ready to act on your behalf if you choose to take this further. James didn't hesitate. We are taking it further. Lisa's been through enough, and I won't let this slide. Patel gave a small nod, a flicker of respect in his eyes. Good. Let me know what you need from the hospital, and I'll make it happen. But James, don't let this consume you. Lisa needs you to be her rock right now. Focus on her. James knew Patel was right, but the fire inside him refused to be extinguished. Thank you, Patel. I appreciate your support. Patel gave him a brief pat on the shoulder before walking down the hallway. James stood there for a moment, staring at the door to Lisa's room. He took a deep breath, centering himself. Lisa was his priority. The fight could wait until tomorrow. When he re-entered the room, Lisa's eyes were open, and she was looking at him with a soft smile. Her voice was weak, but her determination shone through. James, you don't have to hover. I'm okay. James sat back down beside her, his hand returning to hers. Hovering is part of the job description. Besides, after what happened today, I'm not leaving your side. Lisa's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of pain. I can't believe they thought I'd steal something. All I've ever done is try to help people. And they looked at me like I was. Less. James's heart ached at her words. It's not about who you are, Lisa. It's about their ignorance and prejudice. They couldn't see beyond their assumptions. But we'll make them see. I promise you, this isn't the end. Lisa studied him, her eyes filled with a mix of love and weariness. Just don't lose yourself in the process. I need you, James. More than I need justice. James nodded, his resolve softening in the face of her vulnerability. You're right. I'll fight, but not at the expense of being here for you. We'll face this together. The next few days passed in a blur of legal consultations, administrative meetings, and ongoing recovery for Lisa. The hospital staff rallied around her, offering support and solidarity. Delgado ensured that security remained tight, and Patel's legal team worked tirelessly to build a case against the officers involved, particularly Reynolds. The footage, coupled with witness statements from nurses and other staff, painted a damning picture of misconduct and abuse of power. James and Lisa met with the legal team in a private conference room, where the head attorney, a sharp and no-nonsense woman named Evelyn Carter, laid out their options. We have enough evidence to pursue multiple avenues, Carter explained. A civil suit for damages, a formal complaint to the police department, and potentially criminal charges against Reynolds for assault and unlawful detention. Lisa listened quietly, her hands folded in her lap. When Carter finished, Lisa spoke, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. I want this to mean something. If we go forward with this, it's not just about us. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to someone else. James reached for her hand, pride swelling in his chest. Whatever you decide, I'm with you. Carter nodded. Then we'll move forward with all three. This won't be easy, but with the evidence we have, I'm confident we can hold them accountable. As the days turned into weeks, the story began to spread beyond the walls of the hospital. James and Lisa agreed to a limited public statement, carefully crafted by Carter to highlight the systemic issues exposed by their ordeal without sensationalizing the trauma Lisa had endured. Their message was clear: this wasn't just about one bad officer, it was about the culture that allowed such behavior to go unchecked. The public response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in from across the country, from people who saw their own experiences reflected in Lisa's story. Activists, medical professionals, and even members of law enforcement reached out, offering their voices to the growing call for accountability and reform. The legal proceedings against Reynolds moved forward with surprising speed. The evidence was irrefutable, and under mounting pressure from both the public and internal investigations, the police department announced that Reynolds had been terminated. Harris, who had expressed regret for his role in the incident, cooperated fully with the investigation, providing critical testimony that further incriminated Reynolds. Despite the legal victories, James and Lisa knew their fight wasn't over. They used the platform they had gained to advocate for change, working with hospital administrators and community leaders to implement policies aimed at preventing similar incidents in the future. Lisa, once she had fully recovered, gave a powerful speech at a conference on systemic injustice, sharing her story with a mix of vulnerability and determination. "This isn't just about me," Lisa said, her voice resonating through the packed auditorium. "It's about everyone who's been made to feel small, invisible, or less than because of the color of their skin. It's about standing up and saying, 'Enough together. We can create a world where no one has to endure what I endured.'" James watched from the front row, his chest swelling with pride. Lisa's strength and grace were undeniable, and he knew that her voice would inspire change far beyond the walls of that auditorium. As they left the conference, hand in hand, James looked at Lisa and smiled. "You're incredible, you know that." Lisa leaned her head against his shoulder, her smile soft but full of warmth. "I had a good partner to get me through it." The fight wasn't over, but they were ready to face whatever came next together.